For over 1,100 years, one city ruled the Mediterranean like a queen on water. But then, on a quiet afternoon in May 1797, the longest-lasting republic in human history voted itself out of existence in a single sitting. The leader took off his hat, handed it to a servant, and said, "We shall not be needing this anymore." Just like that, Venice was gone. Today, that same city sinks a millimeter every year and stages an annual reenactment of the government it killed off in an afternoon. Yes, they celebrate it. Every story begins somewhere. But for Venice's story, we have to rewind all the way back to the year 697, when a group of terrified refugees waded into a swamp and accidentally built the most powerful trading empire Europe had ever seen. So how did a city built on wooden poles in a mosquito-infested lagoon outlive Rome, outlast every king in Europe, and then vanish in less time than it takes to bake bread? Let's start at the beginning. In the late 6th century, a tribe called the Lombards came thundering down from the north into Italy. They were not gentle people. They burned, looted, and killed their way across the countryside, and entire towns simply ceased to exist. Imagine your hometown being there on Monday and gone by Friday. That was Italy in the year 568. The Romans were collapsing. Nobody was coming to save anyone. So the survivors did the only thing left to do. They ran. They ran east toward the coast, toward the one place no army wanted to follow them. A salty, shallow, half-drowned stretch of marsh full of mudflats and reeds called the Venetian Lagoon. Are you sure about this? It's a swamp. Nothing here but birds and fish. Exactly, nothing here but birds and fish. The Lombards aren't following us into a swamp. And they were right. The Lombards took one look at the lagoon and decided it wasn't worth it. Generation after generation of refugees kept arriving, building tiny villages on tiny islands, driving wooden poles deep into the mud to hold up their houses. They were fishermen, salt traders, and refugees with nothing to lose. They had no king. They had no army. They had no land worth fighting over. So they did something radical. They decided to govern themselves. In the year 697, the scattered island communities of the lagoon came together and made a decision that would echo for 11 centuries. They would elect a leader, not a king, not an emperor, a magistrate chosen by the people who would serve for life but answer to the community. They called him the Doge, a Venetian word that simply meant leader. His name was Paolo Lucio Anafsto, and he had no idea he was founding the longest continuously functioning republic in human history. Imagine being told that the random town meeting you organized on Tuesday would still be running 1,100 years later. That's basically what happened. The first Doge took office while the Byzantine Empire was still standing in the east, and the ruins of Rome were still smoking in the west. Charlemagne hadn't been born yet. England didn't exist as a country. The Prophet Muhammad had died just 65 years earlier. And in a muddy lagoon, a handful of refugees were quietly inventing something that wouldn't be tried again on this scale for over 1,000 years. A government where the leader could be removed, where laws came from councils, and where no single family was supposed to dominate forever. Of course, in the early years, things got messy. The first Doges quickly figured out that leader for life sounded a lot like king for life, and several of them tried to make the job hereditary. 3 of the first 7 Doges were assassinated, 2 were blinded, 1 was forced into a monastery. The Venetians had a very direct way of telling their leaders, "No, you do not get to start a dynasty." It was brutal feedback, but every time a Doge overreached, the citizens pushed back harder, and slowly, painfully, the rules got tighter. Now imagine a young man named Anthony living in this early Venice around the year 800. He's a salt trader. He owns a small wooden ship, and every week he sails out across the Adriatic with barrels of salt scraped from the lagoon flats. Salt was money in the medieval world. You couldn't preserve meat without it. You couldn't pay soldiers without it. And the Venetians controlled it. Anthony pays his taxes to a constitution older than most countries that would ever exist. He doesn't know it yet, but he's a citizen of a state that is just getting started. By the 9th century, Venice had a problem. It had a republic, it had ships, it had salt, and it had ambition. But it didn't have prestige. Every great city in the medieval world had a patron saint, a holy relic, a sacred body buried in a magnificent church that pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to see. Rome had St. Peter. Constantinople had 100 relics. Even small towns had a saint's finger bone or a holy splinter. Venice had nothing. And in the medieval world, having no saint was like having no Wi-Fi today. Nobody wanted to visit. So the Venetians did what Venetians did best. They went shopping. And by shopping, I mean they decided to steal a saint. In the year 828, two Venetian merchants named Buono and Rustico sailed to Alexandria, in Egypt. Alexandria was under Muslim rule at the time, and inside the city sat the body of Saint Mark the Evangelist, one of the 4 authors of the Gospels. The Venetians knew exactly what they wanted. They bribed the guards, slipped into the church, and stole the body of Saint Mark. But there was a problem. How do you smuggle a saint past Muslim customs officials? Open the basket. What's inside? Just pork, lots of pork. Definitely not a holy Christian relic. Pork, get this out of here, disgusting. And it worked. The Venetians had wrapped the body of Saint Mark in layers of pickled pork, knowing that Muslim inspectors wouldn't touch it for religious reasons. They sailed home, paraded the relic through the streets, and announced to the world that Venice was now the official home of Saint Mark. They built a massive basilica to hold him, and to this day, Saint Mark's body is supposedly still there. The Lion of Saint Mark became the symbol of the Republic. Suddenly, Venice mattered. This wasn't just a religious stunt, it was a power move. Having Saint Mark meant Venice could claim spiritual equality with Rome and Constantinople. It meant pilgrims came, it meant money came, it meant respect came. And it told everyone watching that Venice would do whatever it took to climb. Steal a saint, sure. Bribe an official, easy. Hide a corpse in pork, why not? The Venetians had figured out a truth that would define them for 1,000 years. Trade, ships, and clever lies could beat armies and emperors every single time. By the year 1000, Venice was no longer a refugee colony. It was a power. Its ships sailed from the Black Sea to Gibraltar, carrying spices from the east, silks from China, glass from Murano, and salt from the lagoon. The Doge sat in a marble palace. The Grand Council met in chambers covered in gold leaf. And Venice had quietly figured out something nobody else had. To be truly powerful, you didn't need to conquer land. You just needed to control the water between everyone else's land. Then came 1204, and Venice pulled off the most audacious move in medieval history. The Fourth Crusade had been launched to attack Egypt and recapture Jerusalem. The Crusaders needed ships, and they hired Venice to transport them. But the Crusaders couldn't pay. So the elderly, nearly blind Doge Enrico Dandolo made them an offer they couldn't refuse. You owe us money. We'll cancel the debt if you help us take a few cities along the way. A few cities turned into one very specific city, Constantinople, the greatest Christian capital in the world, the center of the Byzantine Empire, a city that had stood for nearly 900 years. Wait, we're crusaders. We're supposed to fight Muslims. Constantinople is Christian. Yes, but they're the wrong kind of Christian. Also, they're very rich. Fair point. In April 1204, the Crusaders, led by Venetian ships, broke through the walls of Constantinople and sacked the city for 3 days. They melted down ancient statues. They looted churches. They stole everything that wasn't nailed down, and then they came back for the nails. Venice walked away with the 4 bronze horses that still stand on top of St. Mark's Basilica today. They also walked away with 3/8 of the entire Byzantine Empire. In one afternoon, Venice had crippled its biggest commercial rival and become the dominant power in the Mediterranean. The Republic now controlled ports in Greece, Crete, Cyprus, and the entire Adriatic coast. The Doge took a new title, Lord of 1/4 of the Roman Empire. Imagine your local mayor suddenly owning 1/3 of the European Union. That's what happened. And here's the wildest part. Venice did all of this with a population of around 100,000 people. A city smaller than modern-day Burbank had just looted the largest empire in Christendom. The Mediterranean now had a new queen, and her name was Venice. With wealth came paranoia. The Venetians had seen what happened to other Italian cities. Florence, Milan, Genoa, all of them had been torn apart by powerful families fighting for control. So Venice did something nobody else dared to do. It built a government so complicated that no single person could ever take over. The Doge looked powerful, but he was actually trapped in a cage made of paperwork. He couldn't open his own mail without witnesses. He couldn't meet foreign ambassadors alone. He couldn't even leave the city without permission. He was a king on a leash. To elect a new Doge, Venice invented one of the strangest voting systems in history. It involved 10 rounds of drawing colored balls from a velvet bag, alternating between random selection and voting, with committees electing committees that elected other committees. The process took weeks. The point wasn't efficiency. The point was that you could not rig it. Bribery was almost impossible because you didn't know who to bribe until the very last round. It was beautifully, brilliantly insane, and it worked for 500 years. But the real secret weapon of Venice wasn't the Doge or the Grand Council. It was the Council of 10. Imagine a secret committee that could arrest anyone, anywhere, for any reason. They had spies in every tavern, every embassy, and every foreign court in Europe. If you were a Venetian noble caught taking a bribe from a foreign power, the Council of 10 would send a quiet knock at your door, and you would simply disappear into the lagoon. Bodies would surface days later between the wooden poles. Nobody asked questions. The council also ran the world's first modern intelligence service. Venetian diplomats abroad sent home detailed reports called relazioni, which were so accurate that historians still use them today to understand medieval Europe. Popes feared them. Kings courted them. Even the Ottoman Sultan kept a personal Venetian advisor. The Council of 10 had files on everyone, and they used those files to keep Venice safe. If you were planning a coup against the Republic, the Council of 10 already knew about it before you did. It was a paranoid system, built by paranoid people who had learned a hard lesson from 1,000 years of watching other cities fall apart. Trust nobody. Watch everyone. Spread the power so thin that no single hand could grab it. And it worked. While the Council of 10 watched its enemies, Venice was quietly inventing the modern world. In 1494, a Venetian friar named Luca Pacioli published a book that would change business forever. Inside it, he described a system Venetian merchants had been using for over a century: double-entry bookkeeping. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Every transaction had two sides, a debit and a credit, and the books had to balance. It sounds boring, but this single invention made modern capitalism possible. Every spreadsheet, every accounting firm, every Wall Street bank today still uses the system invented by Venetian merchants who just wanted to keep track of their pepper sales. Venice also invented the modern newspaper. By the 1500s, the Venetian government was publishing little handwritten news sheets called avici, sold for one small coin, a gazzetta. The word gazette stuck. Soon every major European city had its own gazette. Venice had accidentally invented mass media. The same city was also the printing capital of Europe, churning out more books than anywhere else on Earth. If you wanted to read the latest map of the world or the newest medical textbook, you bought it from a Venetian printer. Venice didn't just trade goods, it traded ideas. And then there was glass. On the small island of Murano, just north of the main city, Venice produced the finest glass in the world. Crystal so clear you could see your reflection in it. Mirrors so perfect that the French King Louis XIV would later spend a fortune trying to steal the secret. The glassblowers of Murano were celebrities, the rock stars of the Renaissance. But their secrets were so valuable that the Venetian government did something terrifying. They made it illegal for glassblowers to leave the islands. Picture a young woman named Isabella in 1550. She is 15 years old. Her father is a master glassblower on Murano, and she has grown up watching molten glass spin into impossible shapes. She knows the recipes. She knows the techniques. And by Venetian law, she will never be allowed to leave. If she tries to flee abroad to sell the secrets, Agents of the Council of Ten will hunt her down. If she succeeds in escaping, her family will be imprisoned. Isabella will live and die on a small island, surrounded by furnaces, because her knowledge is too valuable to let walk away. By the 1500s, Venice was at the peak of its power, but the world was starting to shift under its feet. The Portuguese had figured out how to sail around Africa to India. The Spanish had stumbled into the Americas. Suddenly, the Mediterranean wasn't the center of trade anymore. The Atlantic was. Venice's beautiful, complicated, perfect system was built for a world that was slowly disappearing. The Republic still made fortunes. It still built ships. It still held its colonies. But the Great Age was ending, and somewhere in the back of every Venetian noble's mind, a quiet voice was starting to whisper, "What happens when the money runs out?" Then came the Ottomans. The same Turkish empire that had finally captured Constantinople in 1453 now turned its full attention to Venice. For the next 200 years, Venice and the Ottoman Empire fought a slow, exhausting war for control of the eastern Mediterranean. Venice lost Cyprus in 1571, then Crete after a brutal 24-year siege ending in 1669, then most of Greece. Each loss bled the Republic a little more. The treasury shrank. The fleet aged. The colonies fell one by one. Venice was still rich, still beautiful, still proud. But it was the wealth of an old aristocrat selling off the family silver one piece at a time. The city responded the way old empires always do. It threw parties. The 1700s in Venice were a non-stop carnival. Masks, gambling houses, opera, courtesans, masquerade balls that lasted until dawn. Foreign tourists arrived by the thousands on what they called the Grand Tour, paying enormous sums to drink Venetian wine, lose money at Venetian card tables, and watch Venetian fireworks explode over the lagoon. The Doge still wore his ducal cap. The Council of Ten still met in secret. The Grand Council still voted. But the whole thing was starting to feel like a costume party where the costumes had become the only real thing left. By 1796, Venice had a navy that couldn't fight, an army that didn't exist, and a treasury that was nearly empty. It had been independent for 1,099 years. It had survived the fall of Rome, the rise and fall of Byzantium, the Crusades, the plague, the Ottomans, and a dozen other catastrophes. It was the oldest republic in the world. And then a 27-year-old French general arrived in northern Italy. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was short, ambitious, and absolutely brilliant at war. In 1796, he marched a French army into northern Italy and started smashing the Austrians. The fighting spilled across the Venetian mainland. Venice tried to stay neutral. It had been neutral for centuries. Neutrality was the Republic's favorite strategy. Don't pick sides, trade with everyone, bow when necessary, smile and survive. But Napoleon wasn't interested in neutrality. He needed a victim, and Venice looked weak. In April 1797, a French ship was fired on near Venice and the captain was killed. Napoleon had his excuse. He sent a furious message to the Venetian government. "I will be an Attila to the state of Venice." It was a direct threat. The Venetian Senate read the message and panicked. They had no army worth the name. Their ships couldn't hold off a fishing boat, let alone the French. The Council of Ten convened. The Doge, a quiet man named Ludovico Manin, sat in his palace and stared at the walls. For 1,100 years, the Republic had always found a way out. Bribery, diplomacy, clever lies, secret deals. Surely there was a trick left to play. There wasn't. On the morning of May 12, 1797, the Great Council of Venice gathered in the Doge's palace for the last time. They had been the legislative body of the Republic for over 500 years. Generations of Venetian nobles had walked into that room to vote on laws, elect doges, declare wars, and sign treaties. Now, with French cannons aimed at the city from the mainland, they gathered to vote on one final question. Should the Republic dissolve itself and surrender to Napoleon? The vote was 512 to 20 in favor. Some nobles wept. Some fled. Some simply sat in silence as 1,100 years of independence ended in a single afternoon. Doge Ludovico Manin walked back to his private chambers, slowly removed the ducal cap he had worn for 8 years, the symbol of an office held by 120 men before him, and handed it to his servant. He looked at the cap one last time and said quietly, "We shall not be needing this anymore." That was it. No battle, no siege, no final stand. The oldest republic in the world had simply voted itself out of existence. The Lion of St. Mark had laid down without a fight. What happened next was almost worse than the conquest itself. Napoleon marched his troops into Venice and immediately started looting. French soldiers ripped paintings off the walls of churches, melted down gold from the basilicas, and stuffed centuries of art into crates bound for Paris. The 4 bronze horses on top of St. Mark's, the ones Venice had stolen from Constantinople 600 years earlier, were now stolen again by the French. The Lion of St. Mark itself, the bronze symbol of the Republic that had stood on a column in the piazza for centuries, was packed up and shipped to France. The Venetians watched their city being stripped, and there was nothing they could do. Then, just a few months later, Napoleon did something that should have shocked the world. He sold Venice. In October 1797, he signed the Treaty of Campo Formio with Austria, and as part of a side deal, he simply handed Venice over to the Austrian emperor in exchange for territory elsewhere. 11 centuries of independent history, and Venice was now a Habsburg possession, traded like a piece of furniture in a divorce settlement. "Wait, you're giving us Venice?" "Yes, just like that. I don't really need it, take it." The Venetians went to bed as French subjects and woke up as Austrian ones. Over the next 70 years, the city would change hands 4 more times. Austrian, then briefly French again, then Austrian once more, then finally in 1866, after the wars of Italian unification, Venice became part of the new kingdom of Italy. The Republic was never restored. The Doge was never replaced. The Council of Ten was never reconvened. The Lion of St. Mark was eventually returned, but the state it represented was gone forever. The strangest part is how quietly it all happened. There were no great battles for Venice. No siege engines, no burning palaces, no last stand by a heroic Doge. The longest-lasting republic in human history ended with a vote, a removed hat, and a polite handover. The city itself survived. The buildings still stood. The canals still ran. The people still spoke Venetian. But the thing that had made Venice Venice, the self-governing republic that had outlived Rome and Byzantium and every monarchy in Europe, had vanished in less time than it takes to cook dinner. It was as if 1,000 years of history had been a long, beautiful dream, and someone had finally turned on the lights. Today, Venice is sinking. The city built on wooden poles in a refugee swamp is going down about 1 millimeter every year, slowly returning to the lagoon it came from. The Adriatic rises. The Aqua Alta floods St. Mark's Square with terrifying regularity. Engineers have built massive flood barriers called MOSC, vast steel gates that rise out of the seabed to hold back the tides. The city that once ruled the Mediterranean now fights every winter just to keep its feet dry. There are fewer than 50,000 permanent residents left inside the historic center. Most have moved to the mainland, priced out by tourism and rising water. Imagine Sophia, a distant descendant of that salt trader Anthony who sailed the Adriatic 1,200 years earlier. She lives in a small apartment near the Rialto Bridge. She works at a cafe by day and studies Renaissance history at the University of Venice by night. Every September, she watches the Venice Film Festival roll out its red carpets on the Lido, where movie stars arrive by water taxi. Every spring, she watches her city stage a historical reenactment called the Festa della Senza, celebrating the marriage of Venice to the sea, a ceremony that the Doges performed for nearly 800 years. The Doge is played by an actor. The ceremony is beautiful. The state it commemorates has been dead for over 200 years. Sophia walks the same stones as Isabella the glassblower's daughter, who never left Murano. She passes the same basilica where the stolen bones of St. Mark still lie. She crosses the same piazza where the Great Council voted itself out of existence on that May afternoon in 1797. The city is a living museum of a country that no longer exists, A republic that survived 1,000 years of war and plague and competition, only to surrender in a single sitting to a 27-year-old general from Corsica. That is the strange truth of Venice. It built the longest-running republic in human history not by being the strongest, but by being the cleverest. It invented modern accounting, the modern newspaper, the modern intelligence service, and modern diplomacy. And then it ended itself with a vote. The hat came off. The lion came down. The water kept rising. A republic that was never supposed to last a century lasted 11 and then vanished in an afternoon. Drop your thoughts in the comments telling us which fact shocked you the most. Because honestly, the Doge calmly handing over his cap and saying, "We shall not be needing this anymore," still blows my mind.